There is a piece of granite that fits in the palm of your hand, and by every rule you were taught in school, it should not exist. It is a short cylinder, smooth along its sides, about the width of a broom handle. Wound around its surface is a single groove, a spiral, cut into the stone in one clean and continuous line, as though something had screwed its way straight down through solid rock. The granite it is made of is one of the hardest stones the ancient world ever touched. It is full of quartz, the same mineral that scratches glass and turns a steel knife blunt. And this small cylinder was never shaped or carved on purpose. It was thrown away. It is a leftover, the plug of stone that stood in the middle of a hole while something drilled a ring around it, until it finally snapped free at the base. The man who found it gave years of his life to a single question: what turned in that hole? He measured this core, he argued with it in print, and in the end he reached for an answer so strange that most of the people who came after him have refused to follow him to it. Stay with me, because before this is over you will see the tool that cut this core, you will see the argument it started more than 100 years ago, and you will understand why a groove in a stone the size of your hand has never fully been laid to rest. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The story you have most likely heard about Egyptian stonework is a story about patience. Copper tools, sand, thousands of hands and endless time. Press a soft metal against a hard stone, add something gritty in between, rub for long enough, and the stone eventually surrenders. It is a good story, and most of it is true. The Egyptians were remarkable at this. They shaped granite and diorite and basalt, stones that would chip a modern chisel, and they did it centuries before anyone in the world had learned to make steel. But there is a crack running through the smooth version of that story, and the crack is simple. Copper is soft. You can mark it with a fingernail and bend a thin sheet of it in your hands. Granite is not soft in the slightest. The quartz locked inside it is harder than iron and harder than the finest bronze the Egyptians ever poured. A copper tube pressed against granite does not win. The copper is what gives way. So the instant you look closely at a granite drill core, you are staring at a contradiction. Something cut a clean ring through a stone that chews up metal, and the tool that did it was made of exactly the wrong material for the job. To understand the core, you have to go back to the man who picked it up out of the sand. His name was William Flinders Petrie, and in the 1880s he did something at Giza that almost no one had done before him. He did not come to dig for gold or haul away statues. He came to measure. He wanted numbers more than he wanted treasure. He surveyed the Great Pyramid with a stubborn, obsessive precision that people still quote today, and while he worked, he collected the things every treasure hunter had stepped straight over. Broken tools, chips and offcuts, the rubbish of the process instead of the glory of the product. Among that debris were drill cores and pieces of drill tube, the physical remains of how the hardest stone in Egypt had been hollowed out from the inside. One core held him above all the others, granite, palm-sized, with that spiral line winding around it. He understood at once what it was. It was the plug left standing in the center of a drilled hole. But the marks on its surface did not agree with the gentle story of sand and time, and Petrie was not a man who could let a disagreement sit. He wrote about this core, and the questions he raised standing over it are still open more than a century later. We will come back to exactly what he saw, because it is the strangest turn in the whole account. First, you need the stone itself, and the tool. The granite did not come from Giza. It came from Aswan, far to the south, hundreds of miles up the Nile, where a particular reddish granite breaks from the ground in enormous clean masses. The Egyptians quarried it there, and then they moved blocks weighing many tons down the length of the river on boats to build with them near the pyramids. This is the stone they chose for the parts that mattered most, the burial chambers, the great boxes meant to hold a king, the hardest and most lasting material in their world. If you want to feel why a drill core in this granite is such a puzzle, hold that in your mind. They did not pick an easy stone and drill it for practice. They picked the most stubborn stone in the country, hauled it half the length of a nation, and then bored holes clean through it. So here is the tool the evidence points to first, and it is a properly clever thing. Take a tube of copper, not a solid rod, a hollow pipe, open at its lower end. Stand it upright against the granite. Now pour a little water around the base, and into that water feed sand. Ordinary sand, which is mostly quartz, which is nearly as hard as the hardest crystal inside the granite it is about to attack. Then you turn the tube, you rotate it back and forth, or drive it round and round, and you press down on it as it spins. The copper never does the cutting. The copper is only the carrier. As the tube turns, it drags the sand grains around in a circle and traps them between its rim and the stone, and it is the sand, rolling and crushing under that turning edge, that grinds the granite away into gray paste. The tube sinks a narrow ring downward into the rock. The copper wears away as it goes, so you feed in more tube and more sand to replace what is lost. Turn by turn, the circular slot deepens, and standing untouched in the middle of that slot is a column of stone, a core. When the ring runs deep enough, you push the core hard to one side, it cracks at the bottom, and you lift it out. That plug, the snapped column, is the object Petrie held in his hand. It is the hole's shadow, the piece of granite that happened to be standing in the center, while the drill ground a ring around it, and everything else was washed away as slurry. And the Egyptians did not keep this craft a secret. They drew it on their walls. In the Old Kingdom tombs, in the workshop scenes carved in relief at Saqqara and other burial grounds, you can find craftsmen shown in the act of hollowing stone. A figure sits with a vessel braced in front of him, and in his hands is a drill with a forked top and a stone weight hung on it to force it down, and he twists it back and forth by a crank to bore the stone away from the inside. These are men making jars and bowls out of stone, some of it soft, some of it very hard. The tool in their hands is a weighted drill, turned by human muscle, and it is the same shape of tool the theory calls for. So the picture holds together on its own terms. We have images the Egyptians carved of themselves drilling stone. We have the cores their drilling left lying in the workings. And we have a method, copper and sand and rotation, that ties the two ends together. It is fair to say that almost everything you have heard so far rests on solid ground. This part is not the mystery. This is the wall, and the wall is real, and it stands. Before we go any further, one honest word about what this channel is. This is a place for the questions the ancient world has not fully closed. Some of what we look at is solid, measured, sitting in a museum tray where anyone with permission can pick it up. Some of it is theory, and where it is only theory, I will tell you so in plain language. I am not here to sell you a lost race or a secret machine as settled fact. I am here to show you what is cut into the stone, and then let you decide for yourself what turned inside it. A theory that has never been tested is only a story, and this one has been put to the test. An experimental archaeologist named Dennis Stocks spent much of his working life not writing about ancient tools but building them and using them with his own hands. He made copper tubes the way an Egyptian workshop would have made them. He mixed sand and water into an abrasive, and then he drilled. Not into soft limestone to win an easy point, but into granite, the hard case, the stone that starts the whole argument. It worked. The copper tube, fed with wet sand, bored down into the granite and produced cores, real cylinders of stone, the same kind of snapped plugs found in the ancient sites. He timed the work. He recorded how fast the copper wore down and how quickly the stone was cut away. He showed, with a lump of granite and a pile of sand, that the impossible tool was not impossible at all. For most archaeologists, that was the end of the debate. The hard stone had been cut by soft copper carrying harder sand, driven by human muscle and human stubbornness, and the proof was that a man in the modern day, using nothing the Egyptians did not have, sat down and did the very same thing in front of witnesses. If the story stopped here, it would be a good story and a true one. But it does not stop here, because there is still Petrie's core, and the exact marks on its surface that sent a careful man reaching for gemstones, and for a downward force measured in tons. This is the point where the wall, solid as it is, finally shows its crack. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Look again at what Petrie set down, because it is far more specific than the easy version admits. Granite, remember, is a mixture. Hard quartz and softer feldspar fused together inside the same block. When you grind a mixed stone like that with loose sand, the sand should always eat the soft part faster. The feldspar ought to hollow out, while the quartz stands a little proud, the way the soft rings in an old plank wear down and leave the hard grains standing in ridges. That is not a theory anyone has to defend. It is simply how grinding behaves. But on the core Petrie studied, the groove ran through the quartz just as cleanly as it ran through the feldspar. The hard mineral gave no more resistance than the soft one. To Petrie, that was upside down. Loose sand does not treat quartz and feldspar as equals, and whatever had cut this core had treated them as equals. Then there was the spiral itself. Petrie measured how far the groove dropped with each single turn of the drill, and he found it coarse. The cut had advanced into the granite by a real, visible amount on every rotation. Working backward from the depth of that bite, he estimated roughly how hard the tool must have been pressed down to take it, and the figure he arrived at was startling. A downward load closer to a ton, forced onto a spinning copper tube, driving it into the rock like a press. Put those two things side by side, the equal cutting of hard and soft, and the deep coarse bite on every turn, and Petrie could not make them agree with a simple bag of wet sand. So he set down the idea that has followed this subject around ever since. He suggested the drill had carried fixed cutting points. Hard gemstones, corundum or even diamond, set into the copper edge so that the tool carried its own teeth, and that those teeth had been driven through the granite under tremendous pressure, cutting the stone rather than merely grinding it. A jeweled bit, loaded with enormous force, turning through solid rock. That is the crack in the wall. It is a written observation from the most careful measurer of his generation, standing over the stone with his instruments in his hand, and it carries weight precisely because of who made it. From that one observation, a much larger question has grown, and here I have to be honest with you about which layer we are now standing on. Some researchers look at Petrie's core, and at the polish on the inside of granite boxes, and at the sharpness of certain cuts across Egyptian stonework, and they argue that muscle and sand cannot be the whole story. They point to the speed those marks seem to imply. They point to how regular and how confident the cuts look. And a few, the engineer Christopher Dunn being the best known, have gone further still and argued that features like these suggest tools turning far faster and cutting far harder than any hand-cranked drill could manage, something closer to a machine than to a workshop bench. In that reading, the core stops being the shadow of a patient man with a tube of sand and becomes the fingerprint of a way of working stone that we have not fully rebuilt, left by builders who understood more about hard stone than the standard picture allows. I want to be plain about this part, because it is where a channel like this either earns your trust or throws it away. That reading is not established fact. It is a theory, built on a real object and a real puzzle, and it reaches past what anyone can prove right now. The mainstream answer, that trained hands and sand and copper and time can account for everything we can see, has a working experiment standing behind it, and that counts for a great deal. Denis Stocks drilled the granite himself. Nobody has ever drilled it using a machine from the age of the pyramids, for the simple reason that no such machine has ever been found. The position I will hold to is that the wall stands and the crack is real at the same time, and neither of those facts cancels the other. What no one has completely done, even today, is reproduce Petrie's exact core. Not a granite core, his granite core, with the groove biting equally through quartz and feldspar and dropping that coarse spiral turn after turn. The mainstream says the gap is a matter of fine detail, the natural scatter of an old process we have not yet copied to the last thousandth. The doubters say that gap is the entire point, and the stone itself takes no side in the argument. It sits in its drawer, wound with a spiral, waiting for someone to explain the last of what it shows. So here is where the pieces come to rest, as far as they can. The tool that drilled the core holes in granite, the tool the weight of the evidence best supports, was a hollow copper tube turned against the stone with wet quartz sand as its cutting edge. That is the answer the title promised, and it deserves to be said out loud without apology, because it is astonishing. A people with no iron and no steel took the softest useful metal they owned, wrapped it around a fistful of sand, and bored clean cylinders through a stone that would ruin a modern drill bit today. They did it well enough to leave cores scattered across their building sites, and they carved themselves in the act of doing it on the walls of their own tombs. There is nothing primitive anywhere in that. It is one of the finest things anyone achieved with stone before the machine age, and it was done by the Egyptians themselves, with their own hands and their own hard-won skill. And running right through that answer, refusing to be brushed aside, is the second reading. The spiral that bit too deep. The quartz that gave way as easily as the feldspar beside it. The pressure Petrie could not explain with sand, and the gemstone teeth he reached for to try. That does not overthrow the copper tube, it sits alongside it, a question mark cut into the very same core, asking whether the drill turned faster, pressed harder, and bit sharper than we have so far managed to match. Because that is the part still waiting for us. The cores are real. You can hold one in your hand. Petrie's measurements are real, written out and printed and never quite answered in full. The experiments are real, and they work, and they still do not reproduce every last mark on the single stone that started this whole argument. Somewhere in a museum tray, right now, that palm-sized cylinder of red granite is lying on its side with the spiral groove running down its length, cut by a tool we can mostly explain and not completely, pressed by a force we can mostly account for and not entirely. The Egyptians hollowed the hardest stone in their world and left the evidence sitting in the sand for us to come back and find. Most of it, we have read. But the last turn of that spiral, the one Flinders Petrie stared at and could not close, is still cut into the granite, still waiting, and after more than 100 years it has not yet given up its final answer. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.